Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and literally a warm good afternoon. Sorry, there's a bit of a confusion on timing. We'll try to make up for the timing. Let me first thank the illustrious panel we have gathered here today, and would like to just go with a quick introduction before we start. We have Dr. Anis Nasser here. He's a seasoned sustainability and international affair economist. He's a leader in decarbonization and circularity at WEF. Thank you, Dr. Anis. We have Fiona Duggan. She's a global sustainability senior manager for climate advocacy at Unilever. Thank you, Fiona, for joining us. Uh, Lena, I think so, is going to be shortly joining. She is also the regional head of sustainable finance at Standard Chartered Bank, encompassing the region of Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Americas. Dr. Charles, he's a global head of climate risk, resilience, and adaptation with KPMG. Uh, Dr. Charles has 30 years of professional experience working within government, civil society, and private sector for sustainable development. Thank you, Dr. Charles, for being with us here today. Uh, we have Dr. Karen Olson. She's a senior advisor in the Impact Assessment and Analysis section at the United Nations Environment Program, Copenhagen Climate Center. Currently, she is also leading the Sustainable Development Initiative, implementation of Article 6 of Paris Agreement. And finally, we have Mr. Angelo Sartori. Mr. Sartori is Director of Regional Engagement, responsible for Vera engagement with stakeholders so they can understand the role of Vera and its programs. So thank you everyone for being with us. A quick introduction. This session is being co-hosted by OICCI. OICCI is the Overseas Investor Chamber of Commerce of Pakistan. We are a private trading body. My name is Amir Paracha. I'm the president for the Overseas Chamber. A quick intro on Overseas Chamber. It's more than 150-year-old chamber in the Asia Pacific region, around 210 international members, representing 35 different countries and 14 different sectors. This chamber actually contributes around one third to the government exchequer. So you can imagine the importance of this chamber. And in the last 10 years alone, this chamber actually brought around 25 billion US dollar of investment in Pakistan and contributing big way when it comes to sustainability. So a bit of a background on the chamber. Now, before we start, I think so, I just want to give a bit of an intro on the subject. But before I give an intro, I think so it's important to have some statistics on our country. Pakistan, the fifth most populous country in the world, 240 odd million people, one of the highest population growth rate as well, around 2.4, 2.5% per annum. Uh, I call Pakistan a story of a paradox when it comes to climate change. And why it's a story of paradox? Because we are one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. But when it comes to the emission part, we are nowhere in the top 10. So we are definitely on the receiving end. I think so as a country, we have really seen the impact uh, on being on the receiving end because the kind of floods we got hit last year, where one third of the geography was underwater. Uh, Millions of people got displaced, 2,000 people lost their lives, and there's a loss of around estimated 30 billion US dollar to our infrastructure. As a Pakistani, our per capita emission is less than one against the global average of around 5 tons. So you can imagine that's where we are as a country, and that's what, as a country, we are facing the situation. The problem is so monstrous that it cannot be managed singularly by the government of Pakistan, by the Ministry of Change, or by the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. And therefore, the purpose of Overseas Chamber, which is the biggest trading body in Pakistan, is to collaborate with the government and the ministry to help solve this problem. And that's the whole intent. I think so. Where there's been the missing link because of the last 2 years, there's been enough dialogue that took place, and there's enough understanding about the climate impact in Pakistan. But the missing part is how to fund, because 2 weeks back, our finance minister has given a number that in by 2030, Pakistan requires 348 billion US dollars to honor its NDC commitments. Now, just for your information, as we stand, Pakistan GDP is $350 billion. So the purpose of the private sector is how to come in and unlock the climate finance for the country. And that's what today's discussion is going to be all around. I'm going to be asking questions from each one of you, helping us how to unlock the climate finance for the country and what active role private sector can actually play. Thank you, Lena, for joining. I've already done your intro. We have not yet started, so you're on time. So that's a bit of a context for everyone before we jump into the conversation and try to really learn from your expertise. So I'll move on to now what exactly you are going to be doing. So my first question is to Dr. Olson. And the question is, would you prescribe the development of carbon markets within Pakistan to be an effective solution in influencing decarbonization across the economy and combating climate change on war footing for a country like Pakistan?
Yes, I think the short answer is yes. Carbon markets are one of the most powerful tools we have to involve private sector in decarbonization through pricing emissions. But there are many kinds of carbon pricing, and there are different kinds of markets, and they're not all equally efficient. My expertise is with the Article 6, the international carbon markets, and the standards that all countries in context of the UN are agreeing on the rules, modalities, procedures, the guidance to safeguard integrity, trying to set the international best practice. But in terms of what works most efficient for Pakistan, I would say it's a domestic emissions trading scheme. That's where you can best drive investments toward decarbonization, capping, starting with the big emitters. And then the international carbon markets complement. And I think that's what you have, both compliance, and I'm sure we'll hear more about the voluntary carbon market from Bera, because that's where the activity is, that's where the demand is. And it's a good place to start. If I speak on my personal views, I believe we should let all the flowers bloom, so to say, and that we will have, both from the industry itself and the voluntary carbon market, set high integrity standards. There's a lot of bad projects out there now with no integrity, and it's ruining the reputation of carbon markets, which is a shame. But there's room for improvement, and it is happening with multiple integrity initiatives, both the supply and the demand side. And I think if that's where we start, we are Unit Triple C supporting the ministry very much so, with a very large project, 2 million euros for in-country implementation in Pakistan. And I think this can kickstart the learning and build the infrastructure. And it could also give lessons that Pakistan can use to think through what are the carbon pricing opportunities. You have studies, but it's not implemented. So I strongly believe carbon markets can play a very powerful role in decarbonization.
Thank you, Dr. Olson, for sharing your thoughts on having an active carbon market in Pakistan. And I will naturally transition to Mr. Angelo, um, that in your opinion, what countries like Pakistan do to market their potential to host voluntary carbon market projects effectively?
Thank you very much. Yes, I totally agree about what you mentioned. Only to be on the same page, we have an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with the government of Pakistan. We have several MOUs with several countries around the world because the main thing that we do and we agree with governments is to provide them and the local stakeholders capacity building. Capacity building in the framework to understand the different carbon markets, voluntary carbon market, international compliance carbon market, and even in some cases there are already several developing countries that already have a domestic carbon market or they are thinking to have a domestic carbon market. So right now the verified carbon standard program that we administrate also, it's possible to certify units with our program to all these kind of markets. We have obviously a large experience working in the framework of the BCM, in the framework of the voluntary carbon market, but in countries like Colombia and South Africa, that in the last 5 years they have a carbon tax and the possibility to offset the tax with carbon credit, the BCS program is eligible in those countries. So possible is Pakistan is thinking in the future to do something like that at domestic level with a domestic carbon market. Also, it's good to prepare everything with local stakeholders to have everything ready when that happens. The same in the framework of the Article 6. We also have agreement right now with government of developed countries, that is where normally buyers are located, uh, thinking and preparing everything when all is ready to trade carbon units in the framework of the Article 6 with corresponding adjustment. And we are doing also in our program some updates, obviously to add the specific label and other functions related with the corresponding adjustment. So first, I think it's very important to start doing some capacity building activities because it's important that the local organizations, NGOs, foundations, private companies could be the project developers in Pakistan at the local level in the future, and also to have local validation and verification bodies. Right now, we have some situations, some issues with the BBBs because there are not a lot in the world. And sometimes we have some very dramatic situation with a project, for example, located in Colombia, need to hire a validation and verification body located in India. And that means extra costs that the auditor had to speak in a different language than the local communities. And obviously there are some problems related to that. So the main thing is capacity building. There are other things that could be more technical or operational that I can explain later. But also, I think it's important that governments work with recognized JHG crediting programs. We are working right now in the framework to assess the BCS program in the framework of the carbon core principle of the ICPCM. And we are trying to follow in and receive all the recognition that are happening right now in the framework of the regulated carbon market and in the voluntary carbon market. For example, in the framework of CORSIA, in the framework of ICROA, and also applying what is possible to some assessment that even governments are doing in some different countries. So it's important work at country level later, not only with the BCS program, because I work in terms of where the BCS program is administrated, to work with the recognized JHG crediting program to ensure later the social and environmental integrity of the project and the units that are implemented in this case in Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. Angelo. It's indeed very helpful. Um, I'll come to Dr. Charles, and my question is decarbonization strategies are also fundamental for countries like Pakistan that lag in resources but are severely vulnerable to climate change. How do you think private sector can operationalize funding programs in partnership with public sector for materializing these strategies?
Uh, Thanks for that question. I think that the first thing that I'd like to flag is that in the context of a country like Pakistan, how you finance decarbonization plans is obviously going to be very important, but no less important for any organization is going to be your adaptation plans. So, what you really need to be looking at is integrated climate change strategies that bring both sides of that or address both sides of that equation. Uh, uh, Appreciate or recognize and address the potential trade-offs, also create synergies, but most importantly, create organizations that have the agility, the ability to understand the rapidly changing landscape in which they operate and be able to see the signs, come up with an effective response, and implement that. Now, when you start talking about such a holistic response, of course, this is not going to be cheap. It's going to be costly. And as a result, we are looking at new additional mechanisms to try to mobilize those kinds of resources. Conventional mechanisms have demonstrated their inability to move at the speed, at the scale that is required. Hence, we're starting to look more and more at carbon markets. We're looking at blended finance. And to the point that was made earlier, none of this is an either or, it's an and. Yeah. Now, this COP has seen a lot of excitement about blended finance mechanisms, and rightly so. There is a lot of potential. They have demonstrated the ability to mobilize private capital, frequently at a multiple of the public capital that is invested. And I'm very encouraged by that in principle, as well as some of the resources that have been committed to blended finance during this COP. And even though it's frequently kind of hidden in some of the language, those resources committed included the Loss and Damages Fund, right? So some of that is going to be used to leverage private capital. Now, I think, though, that it's important to. I am pleased that these resources are being committed. I agree with some of the enthusiasm around blended finance, but I think that we also need to be cognizant of and realistic about the challenges. First off, blended finance does not make conventional risks and barriers to private capital investment go away, right? So when we think about the challenges to blended finance, think about, well, all of the pre-existing barriers, right? Private capital looks at many emerging economies, looks at regulatory risk, looks at political risk, looks at currency risk. All of these things don't go away. And to me, I'm quite intrigued by the fact that those things aren't being acknowledged. Like blended finance is going to be a panacea, right? So you've got those pre-existing challenges, if you will, and then we add on an additional layer of challenge with blended finance. And I think that three of the things that stick out, those special challenges for blended finance, include asymmetry of knowledge and understanding between different partners. Banks are trying to get their heads around this. Government is trying to get their heads around this, and also private capital is trying to understand. And they don't always understand the motives of each other or how the other organizations, the other parties really operate, what drives them, what are their parameters. So that's a challenge, right? They need to understand each other better. In addition to that, we don't really have standard guidelines internationally for what good blended finance instruments look like or can look like, or under what circumstances we want them to look like this or that to deliver which outcome. And then lastly, within a number of countries, the regulatory framework simply isn't there yet to be able to support blended finance. So we've got old challenges, we've got new challenges. These can all be addressed, and indeed, blended finance is intended to help reduce some of those conventional risks. It is a part of it, but I would also point out or suggest that as we look at opportunities around blended finance, that we also look at other approaches to de-risking investment, to getting that capital flowing. And I've been really struck, so much of the conversation here and globally is around the role of banks in mobilizing capital. Fantastic, absolutely agree. But there is an equally essential role for the insurance sector. The insurance sector has many different instruments, many different tools, and that's expanding all the time, right? That can be layered into these blended financial instruments and solutions to help de risk and bring in private capital.
Thank you. That's very insightful, and I think so. What's clearly coming out, it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's going to be a very tough one, and we're all going through trial and error to really figure it out. What's the best way to actually get into this blended financing and unlock this climate finance? I'll move on to Dr. Nice, and my question to you is: how can the private sector mobilize and drive innovation for circular economy to pave the way for industrial decarbonization, and that too at scale? So it's more regarding to the innovation, the R&D part.
Yeah, and thanks for the question. So I'll try to answer both on the investment side and on the circular economy side. And thanks for inviting us today, Amir, as well. Um, Obviously, this is a challenge for Pakistan, but it's also a global challenge. The World Economic Forum releases every year a net zero industry tracker. This year, it estimates that in the next 25 years, we will need to invest globally 13.5 trillion to decarbonize across the hard to abate sectors, so cement, steel, aviation, ammonia, and those ones. So this is a shared global challenge, and there are solutions that are relevant only to certain countries, but there's also from the private side solutions that must come for all countries. And these are solutions for de-risking. We started with blended finance, but there's other opportunities also from the private sector on de-risking. I think, for example, demand signals, companies committing to purchase certain greener technologies in advance so that the investment can be made. At the World Economic Forum, we're hosting the First Movers Coalition, which aggregates these demand signals from 100 of the biggest purchasers of materials. Of course, there's going to be co-investment needed. We touched on it, and there's going to be more and more need for shared infrastructure and clustering of industries. So that's for the investment side. Then on the circular economy front and how we can get innovation there. The circular economy is not something that any organization can do by themselves. And we need new types of partnerships to enact the circular economy. And we sometimes call them radical partnership. It's really a new way of doing business. I think everyone now understands this. We've done a survey with Bain & Company of executives, and 9 out of 10 of them were saying that in their circular economy strategies, they are trying to think of new types of partnerships. I'll give you an example of the battery industry, but that could be true across every other industry. If you're trying to recycle batteries, you need to have traceability. You need to know where they have come from, what kind of materials are in these batteries. So this means that the miners from the very extraction need to be involved. Then you need to know how these materials have been processed, how they have been manufactured, so that you can understand how to deassemble them further down. So there is this need for communication and collaboration across the whole value chain from extraction down to recycling. I'd like to cite the example of the Global Battery Alliance, who has released this year the very first global battery passport, which provides this data from miners down to consumers, also to allow them to make informed choices that can then incentivize battery makers to be more on the recycling side. So I think really the key word I'm trying to get out there is both from the investment front and from the circular economy front, it's about radical collaboration.
Thank you, Doctor. I think so. We need to basically bring the blended finance together, the innovation together, And I think we need to bring the dialogue and the policy making together in order to make it work. Fiona, I'll come to you now. And this is, I need your help to really understand what strategies could essentially attract the private sector towards nature-based solutions for emission reduction.
Sure. Well, companies want clear and consistent policy landscapes. They like predictable environments. If they see that governments are orientating themselves towards nature, to nature-based solutions, to regen agriculture, they will orientate themselves as well. And there's a couple of international frameworks that are helpful in that area. So the Montreal Biodiversity Framework that came out last year gives some very good steers in this area. It's something that Unilever supports. Currently, negotiations are hard at work, just a couple of 100 yards away from us, working the global stocktake. It would be interesting to see what comes out of there from the food, agriculture, and nature. If that does go into a political agreement, it'd be very interesting to see how that gets translated into national NDCs. If that does happen, how does that get translated into budgets? And how does that get translated into investment plans? So really, the strategies that the private sector are looking for is predictable, clear, and consistent landscapes. And once they have that, then the entrepreneurial spirit can jump off. Then they can go and work and say, okay, we know this is going to be something that's going to be important for this country. Let's orientate ourselves towards this. Let's do that. So honestly, I think what's happening in a couple yards away from us is vitally important. And also what will happen over the next couple of months is also going to be vitally important. Those are the strategies really that we would need to see.
Well, thank you. And I think so you have rightly mentioned for any private sector, predictability and sustainability of the policies are the key to really drive more and more finances towards the nature-based solutions. Lena, I think so over to you now. Given you represent a Standard Chartered Bank, I would like to understand what roles bank and financial institutions play in ensuring that private sector finance for sustainable projects in a country which is like Pakistan and basically get into this mainstream market capable of supporting the transition to the sustainable economy. So more around green financing, by banks and how is it evolving, or how banks are actually taking that interest to take that risk.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me as well join the panel. It's really interesting to hear the different views and the kind of the indirect ways that we've worked together as well. We've worked on an adaptation guidance note together with KPMG. And that's essentially, kind of the type of work that you need to do in order to tackle the big challenges, and also, look at it from a different perspective. First and foremost, in my view, and just to kind of confirm what Dr. Charles said, I think the way that we should look at green and sustainable financing cannot be in the same way that we looked at conventional financing, right? I've been a banker my entire career. I moved into sustainable finance about 2.5 years ago, and yes, the skills that you have built over time from a banking perspective are great, but then it's the structuring skills and bringing it all together to make a difference and actually make these things work. So you need to think about things like blended finance from a different perspective. We've been doing blended finance for a very long time. This is not a new concept. It's been existing for a very long time. But then how do you transform that into a bigger opportunity, and how do you put a multiplier effect on the $1 from public sector, so that it's $12 of private sector money that you're mobilizing? And these are the instruments that we need to look at. Now, at Standard Chartered, the way that we have been thinking about it is, luckily for me, I sit in a bank that exists in a place in really interesting, very exciting markets. Yes, they are challenging, but that's exactly why it makes my job interesting. It's not easy. We exist in Asia, Africa, and Middle East. These are our core footprint markets. If we were to kind of think about these economies, more than half of them have not made net zero commitments. Most of them actually derive their economic growth from traditional fossil fuels and energy sources. So the way that we have been thinking about it is actually take a step backwards and not just think about it from the perspective of financing, but actually take a step, backwards towards how companies are our clients, how are they thinking about sustainability and transitioning their businesses to kind of greener ways of doing business. And that is essentially goes into the advisory piece that we bring into the equation. So, for example, we beefed up our expertise on technical knowledge on the kind of the transition technologies, for example. We have created new products as a response to what we're seeing from the market, from our clients, what they're looking at, trying to address the specific challenges. And sometimes it's a bit of an iterative process, but not always. And sometimes you can clearly see it generally through how you're interacting with clients. But a good example is our ESG advisory business. We're not really going to compete with the Big Four or with the McKinseys and the BCGs of the world, but where we're playing a role in our kind of in the life of our clients is to come in and say, these are the things, because we're a bank, these are the things that we would expect to see from you in order to continue to bank you. And that's probably how other banks and financial institutions, whether it's lenders or investors, are going to look at you. So, and that's why I say, I mean, this is a business that didn't exist 2 years ago in the bank, for example. But essentially, we're seeing an uptake of that. And again, that goes to my initial point of we need to think about this very differently. We need to think about how we tackle some of the challenges. I just want to go to the point, back to the point on blended finance, because I feel very strongly about it, and I've kind of been involved in a couple of things to address the challenges. I think that it's a big topic, and I do agree that we're not doing enough. I think there isn't enough coordination, which is surprising. There isn't enough coordination between the private sectors, the MDBs, DFIs, on how we get this done. So we've seen country programs; they work. JETPs, country finance initiatives. I think those are still in the initial stages, but we're seeing them bear fruit. The second thing is project preparation. So project preparation, is where we kind of need to align with the MDBs and the DFIs on what do I need to see as a bank in order to kind of mitigate certain things. But also, how do I, as a bank, start looking at financing the hydrogen sector? I mean, it's not like, people say, well, you can finance it the same way that you do LNG. Yes, but there are no off-takers. It's not a liquid market. Like, how do I do that? So I need to think about different ways, and I need to think about different structures, and I need to get my credit team comfortable with a lot of the developments in the market through different methods of that. The third point is creating a secondary market for transactions. So where you are getting help from the MDBs and the DFIs and the public sector money coming in initially on transactions or on projects where a private sector bank is probably going to shy away from it. You need to create a structure that will allow this private sector bank to offtake from you as an MDB or a public sector and take that money and then deploy it somewhere else. So you kind of create that originate to distribute type of business, and you create a flywheel around how the money is being recycled in the economy. And last but not least, I think is risk participation and risk sharing. So how do we think about things like if you look at a market like Pakistan, how do I think about FX risk? If I was to provide a financing for a project that is US dollar pegged, does that really help? I mean, it does help, but then how do I address the other challenges of currency fluctuation and currency risks? And also thinking about, going to my point on hydrogen, I was on a panel earlier this week, and it was really an interesting one because we were talking specifically about hydrogen. For some reason, it just went into hydrogen. And the whole point was being made around the table is that we need to start looking at sharing risk across the value chain. So if I'm a supplier and I'm willing to produce hydrogen and I'm willing to sell it, but there's no off-taker, well, I'm taking the risk as a supplier. But if I'm a buyer and I'm going to convert my system to accommodate just hydrogen, and there isn't enough supply, I'm taking a risk. And as a bank, I sit in the middle and I'm taking the risk of this system not working and not being commercially viable. So we need to start coordinating, especially for new technologies. I think we need to start coordinating more across the value chain to say, okay, guys, this is what's going to work for me. This is what's going to work for you. This is the risk I'm going to take, and this is how we're going to make it work. And I think that part is happening, but probably not enough. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Lina. I think so. Very, very clear how banks can actually play the role. And as you rightly said, there has to be risk sharing in order to kickstart this overall process. Dr. Olson, I'd like to come back to you. And something you touched upon earlier, and Angelo also tried to give his perspective on this. But I still want to come. You talked about the increase in transparency and integrity required in the carbon market. The question is there any way or there's any hope private sector can actually help increase this transparency and robustness and the integrity of the carbon market?
That's a good question, and I think the short answer is not just yes, but it's also no. It depends. There is in the market, Article 6 in particular, a lot of what we call perverse incentives to keep the price down. It's easier to buy cheap units, particularly from forest credits. And in the voluntary carbon market, some of the most controversial units have come from avoidance projects, which is essentially stocks of carbon. You don't cut the forest, or there's also enhanced conservation, but it's about preventing deforestation. And the argument against this is that if you turn these into ITMOs, then those that buy the units can use them for offsets, which means they don't reduce themselves. Does that benefit decarbonization? No, it does not. So that's why integrity is so important, and that's why we are in the negotiations trying to agree on what does that mean? What is integrity? And that is very much related to transparency. How are you reducing? What are your methodologies? How does it relate to the NDCs, the goals of the country? Are you counting it towards your own NDC target? If not, and you sell it, how do you sort of account the corresponding adjustment so that you don't double count? And all this, which is super technical, is very important. So can private sector drive transparency? Well, as I said, they have some incentives to not have it, to have low integrity, because that means you can get cheaper credits. Whereas if you have very ambitious, high integrity credits, they're likely to be very expensive,
Right.
if particularly if they are Paris aligned, because that means countries will not oversell. They keep units for compliance with their own NDC, and if they sell, they have to reduce more themselves. And then coming to the role of private sector, can they drive transparency and integrity? Actually, yes, they can. And yes, they are doing it. Exactly as we heard from Vera, we have, because of this bad reputation of carbon markets internationally, the industry hasn't interested in regulating itself. And they're doing that through, on the supply side, it's the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I sit there, I work as a specialist on promoting sustainable development and safeguards. No harm done to communities and to indigenous people, which is very important, because we've seen a lot of violations where it's gone wrong. And we also see it from the demand side, on what is it that companies can claim when they buy the units towards achieving their net zero and carbon neutral claims. So yes, private sector can do a lot, and they are doing it. Um, and it's you have to get it right because otherwise you risk that it's all for nothing or you even undermine the goals of the Paris Agreement.
Thanks a lot, and I think so. It's encouraging to hear that private sector can play its role, but it has to be done in a very systematic manner, and it has to be done very smartly. Um, Angelo, I would like to come to you, and I think so. You have this. Vera has an experience of working with Pakistan. Has recently signed an MOU, and just in the morning we were actually attending a discussion on Pakistan Indus Delta Blue Carbon, biggest project, and I heard this is the biggest project in the world, where 220,000 hectares have been undertaken. 80,000 hectares have already been, have grown mangroves, and whereas the one which is, kind of administering the whole carbon market, voluntary carbon market. What's been your experience uh, with Pakistan? What kind of the capability your company has actually experienced? What's the capacity there, and what you think that are we capable to do such more projects?
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned, one of the main things in the framework of the MOU with the government of Pakistan is to work in trainings. And if we go in the next level of detail about what means training, one of the most important things is in turn to facilitate to the private sector that probably will be also the project proponents how to choose the right methodologies because there are 200 methodologies in several different JHG crediting programs, and sometimes there are some mistakes to find the right methodology to the specific project. So if we start from the beginning working very close with the government, with the project developer, the current one and the potential ones, in turn to identify, in the case of Pakistan, the methodologies that are more related to the different projects that can be developed there, I think it's a very good step to achieve in that framework. Right now, in Vera and in the framework of the BCS program, we are trying to have more consolidated methodologies and not to have so many in terms to standardize even from our side that we are in standard the list of the methodologies. Actually, right now we have a new red consolidated methodology to avoid the deforestation and the forest degradation that right now is under the assessment also of the carbon core principle of the ICBCM. So it's very important that the private sector in Pakistan all the time is working with the more updated version of the methodologies, also using the right validation and verification body. That is very logic because we have the list of the eligible auditors, so they have to follow this specific approach. But it's the same that I mentioned before in terms to select recognize JSG crediting programs. There are new standards that are just emerging, so obviously, in some cases, they will need experience during the time in terms to create their own methodologies and all the elements that a good standard need in terms of a registry to provide information in a transparent way, to provide a good auditing third-party validation and verification processes, and the list of the technical methodologies. So it's good that the private sector in the country is related to the recognized JHG crediting program. Also, a very good thing that we normally see, all the standard we have some extra and specific requirements to comply with the social and environmental safeguards. And we do validation and verification of these processes. But it's also important that the project developer, the private sector, finally highlight always these benefits not related only with the carbon emission or the carbon reduction. That imply normally extra price in all carbon markets and also provide confidence to all the stakeholders related to the carbon market. So finally the private sector will play a very important role in terms of the technical things that need to achieve all the steps in the certification cycle, but even more because the certification cover a lot of things, but not all of them. And right now we know that the brokers, the buyers, the investors are asking for different things. Also, and you mentioned to do a mix, a blended, or find a mix of solution to finance the activities. The carbon market is one more option, but even us are looking for and developing parallel approaches to complement, for example, with biodiversity credits, creating a nature framework. So in the future, probably we will have several things in the framework of the different carbon markets, but private sector also need to looking for new alternatives, not only related with the carbon reductions or removals. And right now we know that several companies more related, for example, with chemical with the chemical sector are looking for more biodiversity compensation than carbon compensation. So it's very important to know what is happening in general in this term and to complement the finance that all the projects need in turn to mitigate the climate change and also to be adapt to the climate change and have a right mix between the two concepts there.
Thanks a lot. Um, Dr. Charles, I'll come to you, and my question is on something which is nowadays quite hot. But before I go to a question, just want to set a context that Pakistan actually one of the biggest or the largest exporters of textile, and 70% of our exports are actually textiles, and we primarily sell export textile to Europe and to US. Yeah. Now, with this European Union CBAM, which is cross-border adjustment mechanism, will impact countries that export emission-intensive goods to the EU, and textile happens to be one of the emission-intensive goods. Do you think that CBAM could impose significant risk for economy at large, and particularly for a country like Pakistan, who's already trying to fight this menace and been not been very successful, both from import and export perspective?
Yes, it presents challenges. Um, Before jumping into CBAM, I just wanted to say I think that Angelo's point about the different markets is really important. This principle of bundling and stacking, not only carbon credits, but also potentially biodiversity, water credits, bringing those together in a package of ways that makes real change and maintaining and expanding that change possible is something to be looked at together rather than in isolation. With regards to CBAM, of course the EU is not the only country looking at CBAM. So this is something that has happened. It is something that is going to continue happening and rolling out across different markets. And if you look at some of the intentionality around it, it's pretty well thought through. They are going to achieve exactly what they wanted, which is to make other economies decarbonize through the use of trade policy effectively, right? I've watched some of the international debates and tensions with a great degree of interest. There was a large country, perhaps one nearby, Pakistan, that was really quite offended when they realized that, wait a minute, basically Europe is going to put a tariff on our companies that have lower emissions, and the only way to stop that is for us to basically have a carbon tax. So they're saying either we're going to keep that money here and tax our companies, or the EU is going to take that money. Well, we're going to foil the Europeans and we're going to put something in place here. But Europe has no problem with this. They got the outcome that they wanted, right? Which is a stronger message within that country that the companies have got to decarbonize. So I think that what I'm about to say, which is raising concerns about CBAM, needs to be put in the context and recognizing that it is actually and absolutely contributing to its desired outcome, right, which is decarbonization in other economies. So that's true. It is effective. It seems to be effective in some very powerful ways. But there are challenges to a country like Pakistan, which really go to the heart of equity issues, right? So, what this is going to do, what CBAM does in practice, is that it can directly raise the cost of or change competitiveness, raise cost of a product. It can also change competitiveness. I'll give you an example of this. If, for example, Pakistan exports concrete, right? There are other countries that are investing heavily in low emissions concrete. Well, you're not going to be able to compete because, or it changes the competition profile. Yeah. But even if you are going toe to toe with a similar product, Pakistan, for example, has some 65% of its energy that comes from burning of fossil fuels, right? So that then gets layered into the carbon footprint of the product, and it makes it more difficult to compete against the exact same product, but being produced in an economy where you have more renewables, right? So you get those two dimensions that shift the competitiveness of products. Now, in addition to this, you have the potential for a retaliatory action by a country saying, well, we think that this is unfair, etc. And so then you get basically conflict between trade. This is further friction. This is also going to weigh on an economy. So you've got those first two elements. You've got friction, retaliation. And so I think that through these three angles and more, yeah, absolutely, this is going to impact on Pakistan's economy and potentially quite strongly. Yeah. It does, though, flip or provide as well an opportunity to say, all right, to multilateral development banks, etc. If this is going through, we need support, right? To traditional donor countries as well. If you're going to do this, okay, we understand the objective around decarbonizing a value chain, a key product, but then help us work out a solution to this. So I do think that it needs to be leveraged back.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point you've actually made, which that CBAM or the tax being imposed by the exporting country can create issues of competitiveness across the market. Would like to come to you, Dr. Anis, and my question is that the World Resource Institute estimates a potential of USD $4.5 trillion in economic opportunities through circular economy. What is the opportunity for countries like Pakistan to get a share of these finances for decarbonization and circularity?
Yeah, thanks for raising this question, and I think it goes back to the point you were making before, Charles. I think this is the question of how do you get climate FDI in developing countries, and there's the underlying challenges, the socio-economic challenges, currency fluctuation, political fluctuation. All of these are there, and they're long-term challenges every country is trying to fix in the end. When it comes to getting this climate foreign direct investment, there are a bit easier, shorter-term fixes that we can try to use. And I want to talk here about investment promotion agencies. We've released in July 2023 this year a guidebook on how to facilitate climate FDI that's especially directed at developing countries. So I'd be very happy to send it to you actually and to get
Please.
your expertise on it. So we've consulted with India, Uzbekistan, Ghana, and there's I think 10 or 15 real life examples of successful implementation strategies in there. The idea is try to make it as simple as possible, and there's 4 key measures that we have in there. The first measure is, of course, to create an enabling environment for finances to come in the country. And so this starts with defining the climate FDI strategies for the current region, which will be in link with NDCs. In Pakistan, it would also very much be linked to adaptation, which you mentioned in the beginning. Then goes the prioritization, which sectors should be key in the relevant country, and then aligning investment incentives, and these might be financial or non-financial for these sectors. So in Uzbekistan, for example, they've chosen to be very targeted, specifically on public-private partnership for energy transition investment. So they've dedicated a whole campaign website on this specifically. And we see that targeting this type of climate FDI has been quite successful. Once we have these strategies, then we of course need to map what kind of supplier investment there are possibilities in the countries. So creating databases of all the suppliers, trying to create metrics of where they stand so that we see what could be bankable projects. Because in the end, through MDBs, the funding most often is there. What is lacking is what are those bankable projects. So creating these types of supplier lists, starting with a long list, creating criteria to get to a shorter list, and developing also supplier development programs so that those can move from non-bankable to bankable. So that would be the second measure. And the third measure is once we have a strategy, we have potential projects, then comes the matchmaking. In these countries will be MNEs. These MNEs have commitments, and if we see these commitments and we can match them with bankable projects, then we can start getting the machine rolling. So setting up a pipeline and really also helping the suppliers package and promote their solutions to these MNEs has been quite successful. In Ghana, for example, they've created what they call, and I'm going to look at my note, an SDG investor roadmap, which is basically an online portal where you can go and put what kind of investment strategies you want to follow as an MNE, and you get some kind of a proposal on what could be regional investments. So this kind of facilitation of the process for the MNEs have been really quite successful. And finally, once we have these 3 things, of course comes the higher level ambition, which is to try to, as a fourth measure, direct international investment agreements to climate FDI. So this is, of course, a longer term process that happens through international negotiation, working with government stakeholders, private stakeholders, to make provisions directly on climate FDI.
Thank you, Dr. Anis. Fiona, can you help understand what sort of opportunities are there for the public sector to engage with the private sector on ecosystem regeneration and biodiversity conservation?
I think it goes back to what Anis was saying about the bankable projects. So what are the bankable projects that the private sector and the public sector can come together around? And it goes without saying that first of all you would look at what is a private company doing in a certain country, what is it prioritizing. For Unilever, we prioritize our supply chain. We want to make sure that it's fair, it's just, very efficient, and we bring unmissable superiority in all of our products. But the way that we do that is that we make sure that that supply chain works for everybody within that supply chain. So I'm talking about the farmers. How are they doing? How can we help them move to regenerative agriculture? How can we do that? How can we make sure that the best product goes to the customer? How can we do that? But also, I think it's very important as well when we're talking about how do we tackle, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the debt crisis that we've been talking about so much here, is we have to be very careful that we don't neglect nature itself, because that is really the core stakeholder in all of this. We have to understand that actually, what are the good high integrity projects that we can work on together, public and private? And so, for example, we're very aware that nature gives, crop pollination, it gives carbon sequestration, it gives water purification. Without this, none of our businesses will work. Without this, none of us will be able to survive. So what we need to do is we need to come together, look at where a company is, look at their supply chain, and say, okay, these are the interventions we can make. If you want to move to a better level of agriculture, this is the intervention that you can make. If you want to move to a better level of restoration, regeneration of nature, these are the bankable projects you need to do. But I think the key thing here is integrity, it's scoping, and it's working very carefully with all the stakeholders. There's also some very interesting things happening. Again, kind of, I was in a panel earlier on this week, and they were talking about debt for nature swaps, which Portugal and Cape Verde have done. They're doing some very interesting work there. There's lots of innovative financing mechanisms that people can get involved in. But of course, what a private sector company wants to know is, what's the consistent landscape? Is it clear what the outcomes are? Is it de-risked? How can we help on that journey to de-risk as well? So in answer to your question, there's many, many ways of doing it, but there's only a few ways of doing it correctly. Thanks, Amir.
Thank you, Fiona. I think so clearly it's coming out that the integrity is very important, and so as the bankability of the project, that it doesn't make sense or not. Coming to my final question to Lena. So Lena, can you help elaborate on the multiple green financing opportunities that public and private sector collaborations can benefit from, and what must Pakistan do to make itself an attractive destination?
So it's a big question. I think that there are a lot
Big
of.
or a heavy one?
Sorry.
Big or a heavy question?
It's heavy. It's heavy. It takes. There is a lot that can be said about that. But I think, look, there are a lot of interesting kind of instruments that are already out there that Pakistan can tap into. That for nature swaps is a great one actually. The carbon markets is also another solution, but. Just kind of to build up on the discussion that was happening on CBAM and on the supply chain, I think there are also ideas or solutions that we can put in place and utilize some of the, sometimes innovation doesn't really have to be come up with new structures or anything like that, but it's actually about repurposing some of the existing things that we do as well to contextualize what's going on, right? So if we look at that supply chain finance, and there are a lot of ways that you could potentially use the credit, and these are instruments that have existed. They don't exist just because of sustainability or sustainable finance, but instruments like vendor prepay, for example, where you are enabling your kind of small scale suppliers sitting in kind of remote countries, or not remote countries, but even in countries where they don't really have access to renewable energy. So if you're a textile company in Pakistan, well, I don't really have access to renewable energy, so how am I actually going to decarbonize my, it's not like I can just kind of plug in, it's not like a choice that I just have and I'm making the choice of using fossil fuels. It's the fact that this does not exist. It exists, but it doesn't exist in at scale for me to just be able to opt for it as a supplier, as a textile supplier. So what can you do? And if I wanted to kind of build an off-grid captive renewable energy source, I'm probably going to need another 2 to 3 years before it's all kind of up and running for me to be able to comply with the kind of the CBAM or any other taxes that are coming up. So what can you do? You can basically think about products like vendor prepay and say, well, I'm a buyer. I'm going to help you as a supplier raise funding, because the other issue is affordability, right? So I'm going to help you use part of my credit score to raise financing at a reasonable level, and that's where the work needs to happen. To again, I go back to the point of risk participation and risk sharing, and that's essentially where we need to kind of help those suppliers transition their businesses in a way by getting the buyers to also contribute to that piece of work, because it actually serves the entire system. Because at the end of the day, if you're Unilever and you've committed to kind of getting to net zero, you actually are going to be able to do that, not just by cutting off certain suppliers or taxing them, but actually by working with them to bring them up to speed, because then you can do that faster. So taking advantage of some of these is really important. Some of these products is really important to kind of foster that risk sharing mechanism. The other thing is sustainability linked structures. I mean, we do those day in and day out, but actually we underestimate how powerful they are sometimes. A lot of times we actually use that in transactions to direct our clients' thinking towards their supply chain. So, for example, can you improve the amount of resourcing that you get from a company that is increasing its renewable energy intensity, for example, as a mix of its products? And you can get into it. Gets really complicated sometimes, into the weeds, and sometimes my team comes up with these structures and I'm like, I have no idea how you even thought about this, but it's really interesting, and it goes back to digging into the nuances of the certain industries, and who's the buyer, who's the supplier. We're talking about textile, right? So textile, what are the challenges that exist in Pakistan, for example, that I cannot really just apply to the same rules that I would apply to a company in Canada, for example, right? Or in Europe, for that matter. So there are a lot of products that are just kind of need to be repurposed for us to look at green, social, sustainable. But more importantly as well, I would also caution on greenwashing risks. And that's something that we're heavily focused on in the bank, in terms of how do we ensure that when we're coming out with certain products, we're ensuring that there are the right governance and risk processes around it, so that there isn't anything that we are missing. Because sometimes people do things with good intention, but if you don't do it well, it retaliates, and it becomes something that doesn't work anymore, and you take 2 steps forward and 5 steps backwards. So yeah, I'll just keep it at that. But there's so much more that we can talk about, including how Pakistan could potentially think about and there's a lot of work that's being done on that, actually, beefing up the regulatory landscape to adopt to these evolving requirements. Hadika, I think this morning, was speaking about Article 6 and the regulatory framework that they're putting together. I think these are the things that the country can continue to do, and foster partnerships that it has with other governments, but also with stakeholders like us, a bank that has been in Pakistan for a very long time, has deep roots in it, and deep roots with clients and with relationships, to kind of bring it all together.
Thank you, Lena.
Yeah, I just really want to highlight something that both Lena and Fiona had touched upon. There is so much talk about the importance of public-private partnerships in mobilizing capital. I agree. But what both of you were talking about was private-private partnerships in a new way. And I think that those private-private partnerships are as important and have as much potential, and indeed may in many cases be critical to the public-private partnership component as well.
Yeah, they're very interesting. Jeet, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. Very enriching discourse that we had, and benefited immensely. But I was just trying to recollect my take-home messages. I think what I picked from you, Fiona, was an argument to create domestic emissions trading market first. And from you, I understood the importance to have carbon taxation first, before we go to the Integrity Council, which has not enjoyed much trust in Pakistan or some other developing countries, for a number of reasons. One of them is that these are unequal contracts. Recently, under a Supreme Court decision, we lost in international court several $1 billion. We don't have the ability, we don't have a regulatory system in place, we don't have a registry, we have not digitalized the registry. There's a whole plethora of actions that we need to take before we could engage with anyone. And yes, Vera is a very reputed firm, But we know several other companies who sign MOUs to elbow out their competitors with the help of a few training workshops. So for us, it's absolutely important to have not cart before the horse, but put our house in order first before we could invite. And main concern for us for the first three comments is that can we use our emissions trading system to reduce our nationally determined contribution targets? If these are not counted towards that, I don't know which whom would they serve. So that is an important point for us in Pakistan, that whatever we do has to be counted towards it. Right now, when the market is collapsed, we are selling left, right, and center at a time when there is no good market, there is no credibility, and when I will need them to reduce my national targets, they'll be expensive and I'll have to buy them from international market. So we have very deep misgivings about VCM compared to the regulatory market. I don't have the time to go in much detail, but sir, thank you for your excellent presentation about de-risking and the way the facilitator, Amir, has juxtaposed the question of border trades. Now, de-risking is important in a country where we have very high cost of capital. De-risking will make projects even more expensive, and our debt trap will further strengthen. So the de-risking begins by the national capital to becoming co-partners in our infrastructure or other investments. So the question here is a reflection. I don't want to put a question because there is no time. Yes, EU has balance of payment issues with China, but Pakistan should not suffer because of that. So one possible option at WTO can be, not in these forums, is that we tax, as it was mentioned earlier, and we plow it back to decarbonize. Or if there is no credibility that we'll do a fair mechanism in terms of taxing, you tax, but ring fence them to be spent in Pakistan. Otherwise, in order to penalize China, you will be penalizing us. And therefore, my concluding what you call reflection in this regard is that we have several tiers of conversations today, very rich. Thank you for this. But I'm going back with a sad note that you had the ability to tell us your perspectives. I wish you come to Pakistan, even through our video conference, you hear our perspectives as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and trying to summarize the conversation. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot for participating. It's been very enlightening and a very insightful discourse, and we definitely have learned a lot. There's been interesting concepts and ideas, and I think so it's quite heartening to hear from experts like you. There's definitely a place for the private sector to play a very, very active role, not only in a public-private capacity, but also into a private capacity. So thank you, and look forward to the day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.